Baptism of the Holy Spirit. For 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus revealed his mission for the disciples to take his resurrection message to the whole earth. Jesus gave the Great Commission to people who could not possibly do it. Why? Because most of the disciples had no formal education, they all lived in very poor areas under the domination of Roman rule. During the almost 3 years they walked with Jesus, the 12 disciples did not quite get along. Some of them were rivals and fought for the top position in this discipleship group. None of them traveled more than a few hundred miles from home. This command to go into all the world took place in an era of technological limitations. Travel was done by donkey or on foot. He wanted the disciples to do this mission without him. Right after he gave this assignment, he ascended into heaven. Speaking in tongues is not the only sign of the fullness of the Holy Spirit. Look at Peter's life, before he was filled with the Holy Spirit and after. Peter tried to serve God in his own strength. It was right after the Last Supper Jesus had declared that he would be betrayed and everyone in the room would abandon him in his hour of greatest need. Simon Peter spoke with all the confidence he could muster. Peter answered him, "Though all of them are shaken in their faith because of you, I am not." Matthew 26 verse 33. And again he promised, "Even if I should die with you, I will never deny you." Matthew 26 verse 35. When Simon Peter made these promises to Jesus, I believe he meant it. He really meant to follow through, but he had no idea how weak he really was, and how strong his desire for self-preservation was. Peter was at least consistent in his efforts. This wasn't the first time Simon Peter showed inconsistent good intentions and results. One moment he was walking on the water with Jesus, the next moment he was drowning in the waves, because he was overwhelmed by fear. One moment he was making the greatest confession ever, that Jesus is the Son of God. The next minute, he was rebuking Jesus to his face for considering the mission of dying on the cross. One moment he stood boldly in the Garden of Gethsemane, sword in hand, attacking those who tried to arrest Jesus. The next minute, he was condemning himself, because he denied ever knowing Jesus. Finally, Peter failed miserably and despaired of life. The Bible tells us that when Simon Peter uttered his third denial, the rooster crowed. It was exactly what Jesus predicted, a very bad moment. Peter insisted to the servant girl who asked about his relationship with Christ, "I swear, I don't know that man." Just at that moment, as dawn was about to break, the rooster crowed. Peter looked up, remembering what Jesus had prophesied. He glanced at the place where Jesus was on trial. There, Peter's eyes met those of his friend and master. How sad he was to see Jesus' eyes. Luke 22 hours 62 minutes tells us that Simon Peter went out and wept bitterly. Fear and disappointment stole Peter's confidence and diminished his vision for the future. Simon Peter did not commit suicide as Judas did, yet John's Gospel records Peter's struggle with shame and despair. He hid in fear, fearful that the Jewish religious leaders would kill him too, John 20 verse 19. He decided to leave the ministry and return to his work as a fisherman, John 21 verse 3. His faith was shaken when the risen Jesus asked him, "Simon, do you love me?" Peter could barely answer, "Lord, you know that I love you," John 21 verse 16. When Peter was baptized by the Holy Spirit, his life changed radically. Acts 2 gives an account of Simon Peter's transformation. He was in the upper room praying with 120 other people when God poured out the Holy Spirit on all of them. Peter heard the sound of the wind blowing and saw huge flames of fire resting on everyone's head. The Spirit of God so affected these people that they all began to speak in prayer. Peter was right in the middle of it all when the Holy Spirit filled them. His voice was so loud that the people gathered in the streets outside the house were confused by what was happening. Simon Peter, the disciple who denied Jesus a few weeks earlier, stood boldly before thousands of people and declared that Jesus was alive. Remember, this was the same city where Jesus was crucified. Peter was speaking just a mile or two from where the crucifixion took place. He was preaching to some of the same people who shouted, "Crucify him," when Jesus was on trial before Pilate. Simon Peter risked his life by taking a stand at that moment, but because he had been baptized in the Holy Spirit, he had the strength and courage to do what he could not do before. Peter was not only restored from his past, he was also filled with the power of God's victory. As he wept bitterly after the denial, it could have been the last word of his life. If he had remained afflicted with shame, we would never have read a word about his life. He would not have become one of the pillars of the early church. He would have remained trapped in the shame of his past. But Simon Peter didn't let his failure be final. When Jesus rose, he made it his mission to forgive Simon Peter. Jesus went after Peter and made sure the disciple knew that the past was behind him, and that the past did not limit his future potential or goals. Peter was forgiven. Peter is restored. He doesn't have to live in shame. He had a future, he had hope. But even that was not enough. God could not have used Simon Peter as he did in Jerusalem, in Acts 2, if Peter had not been baptized in the Holy Spirit. Forgiveness was important to Peter, but it wasn't enough. He needed restoration, but it was not enough. Simon Peter needed much more. He needed to be empowered by the Holy Spirit. God released supernatural power through Peter's life. Supernatural things began to happen to Peter and through him. The book of Acts records how the Holy Spirit impacted the life of someone like Simon Peter. Peter was baptized in the Holy Spirit, and this marked the beginning of the supernatural in his ministry. He preached with great power, and 3,000 people were saved in one day, Acts 2. He prayed for a paralyzed man, and he was healed, Acts 3. He spoke boldly when on trial before the Sanhedrin, the same court that had terrified him before, Acts 3-4. Great miracles occurred when many people brought their sick to him for prayer, Acts 5. He prayed for a paralyzed man who began to walk, Acts 9. He prayed for a dead woman and she came back to life, Acts 9. He received a vision while praying that changed the way the church leaders thought about Gentiles needing the gospel, Acts 10. God sent an angel to get him out of prison. He was there to preach about the resurrection of Jesus, Acts 12. Friends of Education for Change, this is a review of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. May it bless us all.